The transition that he went through happened days after the traumatic event took place. And I think that's really important to understand, is that your transition often doesn't happen until days, weeks, months, sometimes years after the change, the external event that brought about the need for a transition. So it should give you hope. It should give you hope. It doesn't matter if you're in the middle of a transition, you haven't figured it out yet, you're still in the fog. Well, welcome everybody to the Salty Pastor Podcast. The goal of this podcast is to coach you up in your faith, because it's what you think, it's what you believe, it's what you know that makes all the difference in your life. It's not what anybody else thinks. It's not what I think, or some great commentator or political social activist thinks, or a politician thinks, or a teacher thinks. No, in the end, it's what you think. It doesn't matter what any of those people know, the facts that they have, or the knowledge or wisdom they have. It's what you know and the wisdom that you have that makes all the difference in your life. And so that's why we're here, not to tell you what to think, but help you think for yourself. So I hope that you can answer these questions that really every person needs to answer in their life. The questions of, why am I here? What is my purpose? What do I actually believe? What is my code of honor? If you want to live life more courageously, more confidently, if you want to experience more joy, if you want to have more peace in your life, then you need to answer those questions and you need to grow your faith. So that's why we're here. I am your Salty Pastor, Douglas Peak, and I am here to help you do this. We're currently in a series called Transitions, okay? And what we're kind of getting at is not the notion that everybody goes through change. The question is that when you go through changes, how do you transition in your own life, which is more of an internal thing? And so what I thought we'd dig in today in this series is what actually changes inside of you internally when you're going through a situation or an external change. So what makes a transition, right? And what actually is changing inside of you? The outside's changing, right? There's something that may be unexpected or expected, and it's changing. But the key then is what is actually changing in you as you navigate this transition. So remember, let's go back and build our context on what we're talking about. Change is an external factor that happens in life. Sometimes it's for good reasons. Sometimes you think, oh, I want to get married. Or, hey, we want to start a family. Oh, I'm leaving this job. I'm starting a new job. I'm starting a business. Oh, I'm going to buy a house. I'm going to, whatever, go to college. I'm going to join the military. I mean, we make decisions to propel our life forward, right? And so we have good reasons that we make these changes. Sometimes it's for bad reasons, right? Sometimes somebody goes through a divorce, or somebody loses somebody close to them, or your business goes bankrupt, or there could be all kinds of things. And so a change happens because something bad happens in your life. And I mean an external factor. Sometimes it's very expected. And that is like, oh, okay, you signed up to join the military. You know exactly when you're to report for duty, when you're going to boot, all this kind of stuff. So that's expected. You decide to go to university. You know when college starts, when you have your check-in day to move into your dorm. It's totally expected, okay? Sometimes it's unexpected. Like a young couple, they want to start a family, they get pregnant, and then 4 months in, they have a miscarriage. It doesn't matter whether it's expected or unexpected, that external change institutes something inside of you, and I call that a transition, okay? And you can do one of two things. You can navigate a transition internally successfully or unsuccessfully. If you do it successfully, it results in maturity. You grow. You get confidence and courage. You get more faith, I guess. Your faith grows in size. Your identity is more clear. Your core values are clarified. So every time you go through a transition, guess what? You can navigate it successfully and receive all these things in your life. If you do it unsuccessfully, then boy, it can result in bitterness. It can result in a hardening of your heart. We talked about this in prior podcasts on this particular topic, that you can develop defense mechanisms. And sometimes these defense mechanisms are really bad for your future. Like, for instance, let's say you fall in love, you get engaged, and then you're jilted at the altar, so to speak. Well, then that could create a defense mechanism in you. I'll never let that happen, which basically subconsciously you just decide to never trust a person from the opposite sex ever again. And so, of course, that is really difficult to fall in love again if you refuse to ever trust. So sometimes our defense mechanisms that we develop are poor, and they also hinder our future. You can also develop a fear of any change. Any opportunity. Sometimes if you don't navigate a transition successfully, anytime a change comes up, your anxiety can go through the roof. And so, because you have this fear of change, because the last time things changed, things got worse for you. So this is why I think focusing on the transitional side, the internal side that change brings about in us, is such a critical thing. It's such a critical thing because what it does is it allows you to see how you are navigating these things and how you actually have a lot more control over what you think, what you feel, what you believe, and what you're going to do than you ever imagined. The key is to know what's actually changing in you and be ready for those changes. We established that when you start going through a transition as a result of an external change, the first thing you're going to experience is fog, particularly at an emotional, mental, I'd call it a spiritual level. And that means you can't really see very far ahead. You're just trying to survive, right? One day after another. And today what we're going to do is say, okay, well, as you're going through this fog and you don't have a lot of clarity, something that always happens in the midst of a transition is that you gain new facts. Right? You're going to learn new things. And what I want to focus on today is this. It's how you deal with the facts when you learn them. It's how you process the facts when you discover them that makes such a huge difference in how you navigate a transition in your life. Okay? So I wanted to go to a story in the book of Acts to talk about a massive transition in the life of Saul. Okay? Now, we're first introduced to Saul in Acts chapter 7, okay? And in Acts chapter 7, it says, it talks about Stephen, who was one of the first deacons, and how he was actually brought before the Sanhedrin. He proclaims the gospel, and the whole defense, it's called Stephen's defense, starts in verse 1 of chapter 7, and it goes all the way to 53. It is a great thing to read. That's one of the beautiful things about the book of Acts is it records these early messages, these apologetic defenses that the early apostles used in their environment. And that teaches us so much about the foundational aspects of Christianity. So that's why it's so important to read them. But what happens is, it says in verse 54, when he finished his message, it says, when they heard this, they were cut to the quick and they began gnashing their teeth at him. So they got really upset. It says they cried out with a loud voice. They covered their ears. They rushed upon him with one impulse. And when they had driven him out of the city, they began stoning him. And the witnesses laid aside their robes at the feet of a young man named Saul. So this is where we first meet Saul, okay? Then, if you flip over to chapter 8, verse 1, it says, and Saul was in hearty agreement with putting him to death, meaning Stephen, right? And so on that day, a great persecution against the church broke out. And the church was in Jerusalem predominantly at that time, okay? Some devout men, verse 2, buried Stephen and made loud lamentation over him. But Saul began ravaging the church, entering house after house and dragging off men and women. He would put them in prison. Okay, so then what happens is in Acts chapter 9, right? It says, now Saul, verse 1, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked for letters from him to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, both men and women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. So he wanted to arrest them, throw them in chains, and bring them to Jerusalem. And it came about that as he journeyed, he was approaching Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Now, in this moment, Saul knew this loud voice was God speaking to him. It was Yahweh. And so, verse 5, Saul says, well, who are you, Lord? And he said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. Now rise and enter the city, and it shall be told you what you must do. And the men who traveled with him stood speechless, hearing the voice, but seeing no one. And Saul got up from the ground, and though his eyes were open, he could not see. And leading him by the hand, they brought him into Damascus. He was there 3 days without sight, and neither ate nor drank. Let's keep going. Now there was a certain disciple in Damascus named Ananias, and the Lord said to him in a vision, Ananias? And he said, behold, here I am, Lord. And the Lord said to him, arise and go to the street called Straight and inquire at the house of Judas for a man from Tarsus named Saul. For behold, he is praying. And he has seen in a vision a man named Ananias come in and lay his hands on him so that he might regain his sight. But Ananias answered, now this is really an interesting point. Listen to what Ananias says. He goes, Lord, I have heard from many about this man, how much harm he did to your saints in Jerusalem. So he heard about Stephen being put to death and all the other saints, followers of Christ, being arrested. He says, and now he has authority from the chief priests to bind all who call upon his name. But the Lord said to him, go, for he is a chosen instrument of mine, to bear my name before the Gentiles and kings and the sons of Israel. For I will show him how much he must suffer for my name's sake. And Ananias departed and entered the house, and after laying his hands on him, said, Brother Saul, the Lord Jesus, who appeared to you on the road by which you were coming, has sent me so that you may regain your sight and be filled with the Holy Spirit. And immediately there fell from his eyes something like scales, and he regained his sight, and he arose and was baptized, and he took food and was strengthened. That is the story of Saul's conversion. And what's really interesting is that from this point forward, you read a little bit more in chapter 9 about Saul. Eventually, his name is then changed after Peter's vision with Cornelius, the household right before Cornelius, and leads the Cornelius household to faith, is that we pick up with the church in Antioch. And what's really interesting is this is the point where we start to see in chapter 13 the beginning of the name Paul, okay? And they were now set apart. And he was still called Saul at this point a little bit, but this is where you start to see the change in his name. If you read in verse 9 of chapter 13, it says, but Saul, who was also known as Paul, was filled with the Holy Spirit. And then he performs a miracle. But the point being is that that's where you see his name shift. And from that point forward, he's always known as Paul. So what does this conversion tell us about Saul and about, how he handled it? And what example is it for us in dealing with transitions? Okay, the first thing we got to realize is that this was a massive transition for Saul and then becoming Paul. And he was 100% one way, and then through this external change, this miracle, he then has an internal transformation. What's interesting is that the transition that he went through happened days after the traumatic event took place. And I think that's really important to understand, is that your transition often doesn't happen until days, weeks, months, sometimes years after the change, the external event that brought about the need for a transition. So it should give you hope. It should give you hope. It doesn't matter if you're in the middle of a transition, you haven't figured it out yet, you're still in the fog. Just keep going forward, because eventually the transition will complete, just like it did with Saul. The second thing I think is you got to understand the massive shift of this transition that brought about in his life. He was absolutely focused and convinced and all in when it came to standing against the church. He was completely against the notion that Jesus was the Messiah, and he was willing to kill people or participate in killing people, arresting people, throwing them in prison, throwing them in shackles. He was fully for that. We see the cloaks being set at the feet of Saul. We see Saul's hearty approval of the stoning of Stephen. We see his desire to go to the high priest and say, please give me letters so that I can go and arrest more people. They're kind of similar to like an arrest warrant. It was permission to arrest. And so he was all in when it came to persecuting the church. He went so far as to run out of people to persecute in Jerusalem. And so he wanted to go to Damascus. And the other thing that I think is really important to understand is that the reason he asked for documents is because it wasn't that he was just all in, but he felt he had a legitimacy to what he was doing. And so he was, in essence, you could say, he was rationalizing his behavior before the transition took place, okay? What's the next thing that we could kind of bring out is notice the manner in which he was transformed. So if change is an external event, what change took place? Well, a miracle happened. It says that he's traveling along, and then suddenly there was a what? A light from heaven that flashed all around him, and he hears a voice. So there's an external thing that happens in his life. And the witnesses heard the voice, but saw no one. I think that's important. There were witnesses that can confirm that this took place. But what's interesting is in the midst of this external change, one of the external things that changed for him, I'm sorry I'm using the word change so much, was that he got new information. He got a fact. He was given a new fact. And the fact he was given is that Jesus is God. He says, Lord, who am I persecuting? And he says, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. So the very person that Paul or Saul was opposed to was Jesus. And what was he opposed? He was opposed to the fact that Jesus claimed to be the Son of God, that he was the Messiah. And so he was persecuting anybody who was making that claim, anybody who believed that, anybody who had been baptized in the name of Jesus Christ. So those were the people he was going after. He was opposed to Jesus. But in this miracle, he gets a new fact. And the fact is that I am God. I am Jesus. And you are persecuting me. So obviously we had a miracle. It gets his attention. But it was the facts that changed. Jesus is God. And that's when his transition really started to take place. And that's kind of what I like to focus on a little bit as we apply this lesson from Paul or Saul into our own lives today. And that is when facts change, how do you process them? How do you respond to them? Do they make a difference, or do you ignore them? And what I want you to do is, I'm not trying to present you with new facts today. What I'm trying to do is get you to focus on facts and how you process facts. Okay? So let's dig into that. Now, the first thing I want to address is what is commonly known as anchor bias. Economists have studied a lot about habits of how people spend money and what they spend money on. And of course, this obviously drives the consumer marketing that takes place. And what happens is they have this principle called anchor bias. And that is oftentimes people tend to hear something and then that anchors them to a specific bias. And no matter how many facts they get contrary to their bias, they won't change it. The other thing that works in tandem with this is also often known as confirmation bias. And that is that once you have experienced an anchor bias, what you do is you tend to interpret all new data in a way that confirms your pre-existing bias. And this is why media is so focused on creating narratives. Is what they're trying to do is they try to anchor you in a narrative, and then what they do is they try to confirm your bias by only sharing information that confirms what you already believe. This is often known as living in an echo chamber. What's really interesting is it's easy to see when other people are doing it, but it's really difficult to see when you're doing it. That's right. We recognize it in other people, but we never really see it in ourselves. So the question is this: when new facts come up in your transition, how do you respond? Do you weight them properly, which is a process of logic? And then are you willing to change your mind? Are you willing to move from Saul's position, I'm against Jesus and I'm persecuting the church, to I want to be a part of the church because this truly is God? I mean, you got to admit, that's a pretty big shift. And so why did he make this shift? Because Paul had a commitment to truth and honesty. And what happened is he was willing to have his anchor bias challenged in a way that he could honestly change his mind. Now, one of the things that an anchor bias does is that it creates an emotional tie to something. So when we're confronted with new facts or we learn new information, guess what? Our emotional state often will not allow us to acknowledge these new facts. What we do is we kind of tend to diminish them or dismiss them. So if we have an anchor bias, right, and we hear new facts, what we do is we tend to dismiss the veracity or the strength or the weight of those facts. And this is just a standard human response. Now, that's the difference between people who navigate transition successfully and unsuccessfully, is the more mature you get, the more critical thinking skills you develop, and the more you're willing to challenge your own anchor biases, particularly when it comes to following the Lord and stepping out in faith. And when you're in a transition, it's really, really important to evaluate your anchor biases, because as you go through the fog, you're not going to get a lot of data and you're not going to have a lot of clarity. So if you don't have a lot of data and you don't have a lot of clarity and you get a new fact, what are you going to do? Are you going to dismiss it because you're emotionally in a bad place? Or are you going to be open to changing your mind? And that's why it's so important to spend time with the Lord in the midst of a foggy transition, because you're never going to have all the facts. This is why it says, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not lean on your own understanding. This is why Paul says, be anxious for nothing, but in everything with prayer and petition and thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. So, I think it's really important to understand that peace comes not when you have all the facts and clarity, and I talked about that last week in that podcast on the fog, but when you have a deep trust that I understand, Lord, I have an anchor bias, and I'm open to you changing my bias or my judgment in this situation. Also, you have to ask yourself, how much do I let my feelings override facts? And I think that's really important because facts do matter. And facts, have to be brought to the surface. They have to be dealt with. They have to be engaged with when you're going through a transition. You can say to yourself, hey, this change happened and it was expected, but wow, I have new facts that I have to deal with. For instance, you dream of working for this corporation. You go through the interview process. They offer you a position. You start the job. You start doing the job. But it turns out that what they're telling you to do and what you thought you were hired for are two different things. And then what happens is it just goes on. You address it with your supervisor, and they just keep kind of putting you off. They don't give you a straight answer. And then you're talking to a person, that's been there for a couple of years, and they say, yeah, that's just kind of the company policy, is that they tell you one thing and then you have you do a thing. I've been here 2 years and I'm doing something totally different. And they said, well, don't you want to move on because you were hired under false pretenses? And he says, well, I need the job. It's good money. And if you work here, it looks good on your resume. So now you have a new fact, right? Now, what do you do? Well, is that just that person's opinion? Can you actually confirm that's the case? Well, that's the first thing you want to do. But let's just say, for sake of argument, that you kind of confirm that over time and you see that that is the company policy. So what do you do? How do you process this new fact? How does it override your feeling that my dream was to work at this company, Or sometimes what happens is my dream was to work at this company and do this, but they misled me. And so now you're bitter and angry about it. And you're in a job that you don't want to do. See how complicated this gets is that our emotional state can really impact our capacity to navigate a transition. Here's another illustration of this is, let's say a young couple, they start a family, they get pregnant, they give birth, and then postpartum depression sets in a very heavy way. Okay, they were expecting life. They were expecting this. They were expecting, as the body returns to its hormonal levels, things change. So for some people, it impacts them dramatically, and for others, not at all. And in that particular case, it impacts you. Even though in your head, does it really make it, would you say, palatable to go through it? So my point in sharing these things is, whether it's expected or unexpected, is that you're going to get new facts and you don't want to refuse to acknowledge them. You want to deal with them, and you want to deal with them properly so that you're not using facts for confirmation bias and you're not using facts to support your anchor bias. But what you're doing is you're using facts for the purpose of growing, to navigating the transition, to maturing, and to learning something new. So my opinion is that you should spend a lot of your time evaluating how you process new facts, especially when you're in the midst of a change that's precipitated or caused a transition in your life. You see, Saul learned a new fact. It rocked his world. He didn't eat or drink for 3 days. I mean, think about that. He didn't eat or drink for 3 days. And after that happened, Ananias comes to him, prays over him, he can see again. Then he immediately submitted himself to this new fact. He got up and he went and he got baptized into Christ. So what a significant change. But the fact that he didn't eat for 2 or 3 days shows you how much his world was rocked because of this new fact. But he was able to do what? Let go of his anchor bias, which was Judaism, and that he was a Pharisee and he was trained deeply into the law of Judaism, the Mosaic law. He was able to let that go and see that Jesus was a fulfillment and a new covenant that had never existed before, and he was a Messiah. What a massive shift. So he went, this change, this miracle happened. It precipitated or forced an internal transition in his life, right? And he doesn't eat or drink for 3 days. He's blind. He gets prayed over. He can see again. And the first thing he does is he takes sustenance and gets baptized. Actually, he gets baptized first before he even eats. In verse 19, it says he ate after he was baptized. Wow, what a powerful imagery for us, is that facts matter, and it's how I deal with facts and how I process facts that make a difference on how I grow and mature through this transition that I'm going through. So learn facts, deal with the facts, but ask yourself the most important question of all, and that is this: how willing am I to really allow the facts to mold and shape my decisions? Because facts are infinitely more important than your feelings. So this is Salty Pastor. Things are really moving and shaking. As I told you in previous episodes, it's kind of moving out from the umbrella of the church. It's becoming its own separate ministry. So if you could go over to our YouTube channel, like and subscribe, because the more you subscribe, the more our presence is recognized by the algorithm. We love that. You can give it a like or a thumbs up. That helps too. Also, if you go to our website, and you can donate directly now to Salty Pastor Ministries, and it will keep this ministry growing because it's going separate. It's going to incur all of its expenses. It's going to support itself 100%. So if you're a regular listener, would love for you to do that. It would really help this ministry continue to grow. This is Salty Pastor signing off, and I'm just really happy about what we're doing and studying here. These are some really great stories, and I hope they're blessing you and helping you. Remember, always think for yourself.